Well, hang on. It's not doing the.
And welcome to the React Show. We got a really awesome show for you all today. I think you'll like it because I'm going to tell you why you're probably doing something wrong. Just kidding. I'm sure everyone that listens to this show is doing it right. But yeah, we're going to talk about code reviews and just how to write programs in general. Yeah, I think it'll be a lot of fun. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm completely wrong about this, but I don't think so. Anyways, we'll discuss it. Yeah, so we're Owl Creek, a high performance React consultancy. I'm Thomas with my co-host Austin. Welcome, Austin.
Hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, I don't think that you're doing it wrong. I always value your code reviews. When you first were starting to review my code, I was like, yo, like just rip me a new one, man. I need some good reviewing. And you're like, no, that's how I do with everyone. And I've learned a lot, and the things that you are always asking me questions about, you make me really look back at my code. It's a very good QA on my code, so I appreciate it. And I look forward to discussing these things with you today.
Well, thank you. What you might find interesting, or maybe not, is that I think even the reviews that I often do for you are wrong, but I do them anyways. So we'll talk about that.
Well, I feel like that's part of how we are. You know, we're always doubting ourselves, perhaps.
Well, it's not so much doubting. We'll get into it.
Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, let's just get it right into this then, I guess. After I remind you that you can send feedback or questions to the React show at owlcreek.studio, send us an email there, and we'd be happy to hear from you. But yeah, we'll get into this. So first, I think we'll start with the foundation for what I think makes a program good. And of course, we can hear what Austin thinks makes a program good. Yeah, so I think the first thing I look at when I look at a program to evaluate how good it was written is it using the least amount of code to accomplish its goals? And that's like that can be a really hard thing to judge because like you just read through code and that might not seem clear to you. But the way I do it is I read through code and then I think, okay, are there ways that I could redo this program to have it be more concise? Are there or parts of this program or this function or whatever? But generally I try to look as high level as I can. Like are there, sort of patterns that I'm seeing throughout this code base that I could use to create a better abstraction that would allow me to write less code and do the same number of things. So that's the first thing that I look at. And of course, I think tying into that is, having the least number of bugs that you can have reasonably in a piece of a program. And that one is not one that you can usually just judge necessarily by reading through. That's something that I sort of intuit by how well it seems to be designed. And, I don't have a great metric for how I look at that. Maybe that's more of just something that as you do more programming, you'll get a feel for. Maybe if somebody has developed a metric, that would be interesting to talk about. But anyways, I try to look and get a feel for that. And then I think, when you're programming most programs, especially in industry, it needs to be readable for other programmers and extensible so that, when the CEO decides that in 1 week we need to add this major new feature, we can actually do it, So that's something I look at. And I like to summarize all of those as having the right abstractions, because that's what I think it comes down to. If you have the right abstraction, you're going to systemically reduce the number of bugs that you have. You're going to have more concise code, so you're going to have less code, and less code is always better. And you will so readable and extensible, I think, also are tie into having the right abstraction, because to me, the right abstraction is readable and extensible. It's something that when I'm reading through a program and and you don't even really realize it, but it all just clicks and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, or that API makes sense, and you don't really have to think about it. You don't have to look at the docs all the time, you know? Like to me, that's like a good indication of the right level of abstraction. Now, you might need to learn concepts. I think that's perfectly fine. Maybe you get to something in the code and you're like, wow, this is weird. I never seen anything like this. But it's just a concept that you go and learn once, and then it all just makes sense. You know, a poorly done code is like one where you're always having to refer back to different areas, and the functions get called in this order over here with these arguments, but over here they get called in this order, and things just don't really match up. It doesn't seem well thought out, and so that's what I look at in terms of the right abstraction and having good code. Now, there's of course other factors, but to me those are sort of the highest, most important things. But yeah, I'm curious to hear what you're thinking over there, Austin, about what makes a program good in terms of code.
Well, later on in the episode, I think we touch on the don't repeat yourself principle. And while we were going over this section, it made me think about the KISS principle of keeping it simple, stupid, or rather, keeping it stupid simple. Um, because, yeah, a lot of the time when I'm going in and writing things, we get ideas of how to engineer some really amazing solution, whereas maybe for the first commit trying to do just to get it working, it's better to really just keep it simple and don't get ahead of yourself abstracting things, which is typically going to maybe lead to the least amount of code, but maybe you'll get there through the refactoring. Um, Currently in a project we're working on right now, um, there's a few people on our team, and a feature is being developed by a coworker, and we kind of got the coworker is new, and we have a bit of like we have a PR that is now in review, and the code wasn't really necessarily discussed with everything on the team beforehand. So it's like one person can implement a solution one completely different way, but when you're in a team environment and the team is going to have to then even use that feature implementation when they begin implementing other features, it's really important to kind of have a consensus ahead of time on how things are done. And I find that discussing things ahead of time really helps to make a program good so that you can kind of get out of your own head, out of your own box, and make sure that you're approaching things in the right way, which is great and easy to do when you do have other people helping you, but perhaps when you're on your own, only experience can really give you that.
Yeah, I think you're really touching on, sort of how do we go about getting good code, like, getting feedback from other people, which I think ties in really well with this discussion on code reviews because, I think yeah, maybe, 5, 10 years ago, they really started to become a lot more common in the industry, something that it's definitely like people have been doing code reviews for a lot longer than that, but it really became a thing that you have to do basically, more recently. And I think in a sense that's great for exactly the reason Austin says, which is like collaborating with your team. It's definitely a good way to do that. Now you're maybe more familiar with code that you wouldn't have been, and you might have better ideas on how to do something because of your familiarity with a different part of the code base or just different experience. I think that's a really great point. We'll talk a little bit later on about more about my thoughts on how to do that the right way. But in the meantime, I thought we would sort of take an intermediate step and talk more about what you were talking about, which is how do you get to a good program? And actually, a former coworker of ours said this, I thought, really well. It's something that I've thought for a long time, but didn't think of it in these terms. And that is, writing a good program is a lot like writing a book. You do it in revisions. And I thought that was a really great analogy to the right way to write programs and do code reviews. And so what I mean by that is like when I write a program, the first version, or so let's start with the book side of it. When I'm doing writing, and I think this is something that a lot of people have learned works well for writing, is the first version you write, you don't worry about grammar or minor mistakes. You don't go back and edit while you're writing. All you do is just write and write and write. You just get everything down. Then you go back and you read over it and you revise it and you edit it and you remove stuff and add stuff, and you do that a few times. Now, I would say contrast that to the way that a lot of people seem to write code at their job, and that is you write the code once, submit it for code review, people make a few comments, you make some changes, you submit it, and you move on. Now, I don't think that leads to very good programs. I think the code review culture leads to that happening because code reviewers are like basically nitpicking all of the easy stuff, like, oh, you did a copy paste here, you need to be more dry, oh, you did this or that, that are sort of like obvious things that don't really, in my opinion, matter that much at first, because in my head it's the first revision. When the code review comes in, I look at it and go, okay, this is the person's first revision of this book. Like, I'm not gonna worry about all this minor stuff. It's the first revision. And I think, down the road, and this is the way I do it, is down the road, I have written more code and I look at all of that code together and I go, okay, how can I improve this code as a whole? Are there patterns in this code that I can utilize? And so I do a refactoring, and that's what I would call my revisions on it. And so I think, in my experience, that's by far the best way to get good code. It's not to try to get perfect code up front that all the code reviewers are just going to give their stamp of approval right away without comments. Like, to me, that actually is an indication that you've over-engineered things. You've put too much time into it. Like, I almost expect on early versions of code, the first time it gets committed that, I don't want to see like security vulnerabilities or something. Like, I'm definitely looking for that. But like overall, in terms of like how clean the code is and stuff, I'm not worried about that. Like, to me, I expect to see it a little rough because that means you didn't put too much time into over-engineering it. I think that's a big, and I know that's a big difference from the way most people look at code reviews, but I don't know if that explains my approach at all, Austin, and why you see me do the things I do. But that is kind of at the heart of why I code review things the way that I do. Yeah, curious if you have any thoughts on that.
No, yeah, I like that a lot. You've actually helped me learn a lot of things through these types of reviews by looking at how I wrote things and helping me look into where I can refactor. Kind of going into the previous episode with the use effect, how I was just kind of using this use effect hook in a feature for pretty much no reason. I didn't have to add it in there. I could have done all of the effect stuff um, in the initial handler function that it had to set state, but like I was then using the use effect to listen to that state update to then update this query parameter thing. And instead, it was like, well, you could just store that value as a local variable and set the state to that local variable, and then run all the code that you have in that use effect in there in the handler function. And I was like, oh, that totally like was using this use effect hook kind of as like a hammer for all solutions, just making everything into a nail, right?
Yeah.
So it makes me also like think about, instead of just like getting to a point where I'm like, hey, I have this code review, and you're like, you go into it and you have no clue what this book is even about. I feel like a really good thing to do is this concept of like a pre-review, or where you chat with your teammates and be like, hey, what do you think about the consensus on like doing like I have to do this certain feature. How would you guys like to be able to interact with this feature set in the future? Because like if you do that, you do your own implementation on, and then you submit a code review, and then it's like, hey, we probably should like re-engineer this whole thing. Um, how much time gets wasted there in that first revision of the book?
Yeah, I think actually it ties into another thing you might notice about my, or at least what I try to communicate about my code reviews is usually I approve the review even if I have a bunch of comments, right? Like I don't know if other people notice that, but that literally means you can go ahead and merge it as is. I don't actually expect you to fix all these things now. What I'm actually doing is saying, hey, in your next revision, maybe look out for these things. But I think there's, even in what you were talking about, like the pre-review, I definitely think that can be useful and I do use it sometimes. But I think getting hung up on the first revision and spending too much time on it is a big problem. And I think it's because of this code review culture. I am actually perfectly fine with code that is pretty bad being committed on the first revision, like bad, obviously again, I'm looking for things that matter. Like, does it implement the feature correctly? Does it, have security bugs, things like that are showstoppers. And I will say, no, you need to redo this code review. But other things, I look at it in terms of revisions. Like, yeah, this is the first time you've done it. And I don't want you to spend too much time trying to get things right necessarily. And I'll tell you sort of story about this in one of the current projects I'm working on. So I knew when I was writing this, like essentially page or set of pages, that I was going to be doing something very similar 3 other times. And this is my rule of 3. And so I actually try to copy and paste things at least 3 times before I dry it. I don't repeat myself. And when I started this project, I'm like, I know I'm going to get there. It's planned. But I'm not going to worry about it. So when I did the second set, after I wrote all the original code, I wrote the original code not worrying at all about these other things. I'm like, okay, I know in these other things I'm going to have some differences. And I could over-engineer it and be like, okay, I'm going to try to plan for that and write a component that will work in all 3 or whatever. I absolutely do not do that. I write it only for my current situation. And then when I went to start the next set of pages that are very similar, I copy and pasted them and just modified them without worrying whatsoever about anything they shared. And I did that again the third time. But then on the third time, I look at it and I look at all 3 together and I look at, okay, now where are things shared? Where are their patterns? And now that I can look at all 3 together, it's super easy and super obvious to, find the right abstractions, which is what we're talking about. You're like, oh, this would make sense as a component, and these are the props it should take, because I already know this is what all 3 need, and this is what the output should be. Now, if you started and tried to do that from the beginning, I absolutely guarantee you are going to get it wrong. And your abstractions are going to be wrong, but you've already made these abstractions, you've invested in them, and you're not going to like go in and be like, oh, no, I'm going to do all this refactoring on all these components I made and all these different abstractions and hooks. And no, you're going to just reuse them and try to hack them to be the way that works instead of, this is what we've talked about before, is the bottom-up approach of programming. That's what this is. It's my view that it's way, way easier to write good code if you can see all the code written already and then figure out how to combine it. And I think that is runs into a big problem with the code review culture we have, where if a lot of people saw you doing that, they would get really upset. And they would be like, hey, you literally copy and pasted this code. This is literally the same thing. Why are you doing this, after the second one, And so people end up from the first time in the first revision trying to do everything right. And I think that actually leads to a much worse code base.
Yeah, I agree very much because if you try to solve edge cases ahead of time and the edge cases are so tightly coupled with the abstractions you're making that they don't apply to other situations, you're then going to have to implement more hacks into that abstraction to like
Yep.
de-abstract the edge cases. Like there's an example of this making an autocomplete that fetches paginated data from the server where I ended up making probably like 15 of these autocompletes and it was like it was looking like okay I definitely have repeated myself a lot but like each of these is like there were minor variations within the component itself that I was like, I don't even know how I would abstract these like variations into a prop effectively. And so it's like I still have, and as we've been developing more features for the software we're working on right now, each of these individual highly duplicated components is continuing to grow in their own individual complexity now as things go along. And if I had tried to make one component to rule them all from the beginning, it would really be quite problematic at this point because out of the 15, about 6 of them are like highly individual at this point. So yeah, it's you have to be careful, but also at the same time, um, in our software culture, to actually be able to take the time
Mm-hmm.
and be have that time budgeted to go back and properly refactor and create the right abstractions it usually is like overlooked and you have to like fight for it in your company's culture and it's like oh well why does that matter and it's kind of funny how this is seemingly a shared problem in every single company I've been in
Yep.
where we move too fast, create software that is like not taking into account certain business logic or certain technical aspects that do need to be handled but are ignored. And then later on down the road, we get to handling them and it's almost too late and it's just a big pain. And it's like, why does that same mistake keep happening? Like,
Mm-hmm.
have we not learned? It happens in every company I work with. I just don't understand. So I'm glad that we, at least with running this company together, we can at least hopefully not do that for our own work, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that is this all ties into the larger culture of software development and even like my rule of 3 or whatever. The problem that I run into is people are like, I thought you already wrote that code. We didn't budget time for you to write it better. You know? Like that's just not how they think. For some reason it's become this thing that software development is like write once, run forever perfectly, even though like we all know that's absolutely not how it works. But like for some reason it's treated that way. When like, as a culture, it needs to be changed to think of it, in terms of revisions. Like it gets better with revisions. It will all be better off, but it's hard to get that time budgeted in. That's so true, and so unfortunate. I think, this is actually related to another podcast topic I've been wanting to talk about, which is like, how do you structure software teams and software development to produce high quality software? And it all again ties into this culture, where it's turned into, you write the code once, submit it for code review, get a few minor things, merge it, and then you move on. And then the only time anyone ever like changes that code is when somebody says add this new feature to it, like that's in my opinion leads always to really bad software in the end. And so it starts out fine, you move fast, and then don't revise things, and you end up where I think most people feel that, they're place of work has poor code quality, and I think it matches the culture that we have in the software industry right now. Um,
Well, and it's pretty dangerous too to not make consistent time on a regular interval to be able to go back and handle these refactorings and abstractions because I mean, I can tell you in this current, in any project I've worked on, if I write code and then like a month or two later, I have to revisit it and I haven't touched it at all, sometimes I'm like, wow, like I don't even remember like writing any of this because I've been doing so many other things I've been piled on it. And sometimes that can be beneficial because you get some fresh eyes on it and you can be like, oh, hey, like it's kind of going for a walk and coming back solve it again. But at the same time, you then approach something you perhaps don't even remember how it works properly, and then you be implementing a new feature into this now foreign implementation, and that can create even more unintended side effects and or edge cases that you end up creating bugs for. So yeah, they're establishing a correct cadence for this kind of stuff is very important, and I hope we get to that episode soon so we can preach our ideals from the mountaintop.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, so I definitely agree. I think now we can actually maybe talk like more specifically. The sort of title of this podcast is that you're doing code reviews wrong, and we've already talked about that a lot. But we can talk about maybe more ways you are, and then how maybe you can do them better. And so yeah, I would say like what I see in most code reviews is what I call nitpicky. It's basically somebody read through the code like it's a book and then marked anything that stood out, like, oh, you could have put this in a constant or something, so sort of like, it's like, yeah, that's true, but like, okay, like it's not really groundbreaking. It's not like you did something functionally wrong or something. But they will point out a few things like that and move on with their life. To me, that doesn't actually make better code. I mean, you do get some value maybe because the reviewer is slightly more familiar with that code and they might not have been, but like, I don't know. It doesn't have much value in my mind. I would rather actually not even do code reviews then, if that's how people are going to do it. It's just not, to me, it doesn't actually make your program significantly better. But that's how most people do it. And I understand that. Well, okay, I sometimes have done that actually. Not because I wanted to, but because there's also this expectation that like, oh, you have to be doing code reviews. And maybe you're not given enough time to do an effective code review. Like, I think an effective code review can take a lot of time and it can be really hard. You have to do a lot of thinking and, okay, how does this actually work? Like in Austin's case, all right, is there something wrong with this usage of use effect? Is there a better way to use it? Like what that takes like actual thinking and work, whereas what I usually see with code reviews is not that level of thinking. It's just obvious things that somebody sees. And it's all fine and good, I guess, but to me, I don't think it's really worth it. I think if you're going to do code reviews and you want them to be meaningful, you should look at it at a systemic level. Like, okay, are there actual functional things wrong? Is there, something like actually in terms of abstractions that could be done better, something that would actually make the code base better as a whole, not just like fixing this one tiny nitpicky thing. Now, later on down the road, if you're actually on a team that does revisions on their code base, maybe it's the third time they've submitted the same code, then I think it makes more sense to do stuff like that because you've probably already resolved the big things. And if you do it in the reverse order, where you try to like solve the little things and then the big things, you're just wasting your time because you're going to rewrite the code that somebody was nitpicky about to begin with. So I don't know. To me, it's like not a big deal. Another part of it is I think people need to really start looking at code reviews in the revision sense of the first, time it's submitted. it's not that important to look at the nitpicky stuff. And it's also not that important to hold the code back unless there's actual functional issues with it. Like, get it into the code base and make it better over time. Don't try to get it perfect the first time. As Austin was saying at the very beginning with the KISS principle, like, just get it in, and we'll make it better as time goes on. But if you just try to get it right the first time, you'll end up in the other case Austin was talking about, where we had the coworker that sort of over-engineered a solution. And I think that happens all the time, and it's because people are trying to get that, like, perfect code review. Everyone thinks I'm great at programming type of thing. Yeah, I don't know if you see that, Austin, but at least that's what that's what I see.
Well, yeah, I think a big thing that a lot of people do, and I've been guilty of it myself, is not really trying to understand what you're reading first, but like thinking about how you can already improve it or change it or fix it, instead of just looking at it from like, hey, what did this person write? They obviously did it for a reason this way, and looking at like
Mm-hmm.
how to kind of, you put your ego out and like just read it as if you were them, like, hey, what were they trying to accomplish? And by focusing on the review first there, you actually, yeah, you'll find potential real problems within the code, instead of just like scrolling through and being like, oh, like you should put this into constants or whatever you want to do. And then you actually do provide quality. And like, that's where I say I appreciate the reviews that you've given me, because you do take the time usually to
When
read
I can.
through what I've implemented,
Yeah.
um, and actually help like make me think about like what I've written in a different way.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's interesting you say, I usually do it. That's actually true. I wish I could always do it. This is, again, part of the culture is code reviews are one of those things they expect you to do, but not expect you to spend the correct amount of time on it, in my opinion. And so sometimes you're just like, okay, we have this rule that code has to be reviewed before it gets merged. But do we always have the time to review it effectively? No. And so you're left with this situation where you're like, I'm just going to have to approve this, even though like I I didn't get to do a review at the level that I think it needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, I when I'm doing reviews, especially for this one client, I take the time to do them. I've even gotten in the habit of, especially if I know like how to quickly test it, I will even try to go through and like test the code by checking it out and putting time into reviewing it, and like really reading through things, maybe not line per line, line by line on like the import statements and stuff like that. But when you're going into like these main functionalities, like if you don't take the time to like read it line by line and understand it, like you're not going to be providing any value, and you're not providing value to the person whose code you're reviewing, and you're not providing value to the software you're helping deploy.
Yeah,
So
and actually, I think it's even worse than that. I totally agree, and I think it's worse. You're providing sort of negative value, not on purpose. You're kind of forced to do it, but you're sending signals like, yeah, this code is fine, when you don't actually know it is. Like, yeah. So I think you make a really good point there. It's unfortunate, and you know, but I guess what we're saying is, yeah, you're doing code reviews wrong. Part of it is because you have to, and yeah, that's true.
yeah.
But at least I think it's good to start talking about this as an industry and hopefully change that culture in some way, because we're not going to get better software unless we do. I think code reviews are a great idea, and I encourage places to do them, but they need to be done right. Just like anything else, if you don't do it right, what's the point of doing it? And that's like, especially when I see these rules like, oh, you must have X number of code reviews before merging it or whatever. I'm always like, no, just because I don't think that means anything. Anybody can approve something, and there's not, I guess there are some places, like say the Linux kernel, where I don't know if this is true, but I've heard, there is some level of accountability around, like, okay, if you approve this feature, you're equally responsible for it. And so people are taking a lot more time to make sure it's good, you know? That is not
Or
some
not reviewing at all.
Yeah. Yeah, so but it's like that's not something that happens at most places I've worked at, where they're like, "Yeah, we're making everyone equally responsible if you approve this. And if there's a bug, you are equally responsible for fixing it," or whatever. Like, sometimes people might say kind of those things, but it's never really true. I mean, if you're the original author of it and there's a bug, they're coming after you, like, whereas, I think that is actually a much better way of doing it, because it forces you to do it more of the right way. It doesn't guarantee it, but like, if you're equally responsible for the outcome, you're going to make sure it's right, if there's actual consequences.
Yeah, it makes me think about just taking everything more seriously. You wrote about like writing code as contracts, right? And we talked about that in a previous episode, like how like everything you're writing, it's like it has to be done with purpose. Everything that you're reviewing should be done with purpose. And yeah, I feel like this is kind of an existential problem we have with work in general. Is like, after you've been doing it for maybe in the beginning, you're like, oh yeah, like I review everything. I'm like committing all this time and effort, and then like the mundanity of the job, etc., can kind of set in, and it makes the whole process of reviewing start to lose its integrity and value. So it's like finding a way to make sure you can like have some sort of integrity to like yourself, to your job, to like what you're putting out, and taking it seriously. I think ultimately drives this quality that we're aspiring for.
Yeah, I couldn't say it better myself. Yeah, I think that was a great way to wrap up this episode. Did you have anything else you wanted to add, Austin?
Um, I mean, yeah, don't be afraid to do the right thing and do what needs to actually be done, even if it isn't popular or seen as the necessary thing to do, because it may not at the moment, but down the road, usually you will get thanked for what you have done.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, this has been fun, and I hope everyone now knows how to do code reviews right, even though they're not able to. Just kidding. Hope this has been a good way to at least, start this conversation and start moving in the right direction. And yeah, this has been Thomas and my co-host Austin with Owl Creek. And yeah, we'll be back next week.